Okay, so you've brought us some really fascinating material today. We're diving into how fifth graders think.
That's right. Specifically how they think about science and scientific ideas.
And we're going to unpack how these kids evaluate what makes well, a good scientific model. We're focusing on these things called epistemic criteria.
Exactly. Epistemic criteria, they're basically the standards, the rules, you could say, that scientists themselves use to judge models and theories.
Right, the standards. And the sources you shared suggest there's a real aha moment here. These young students, they seem to have a surprisingly sophisticated grasp of why certain standards matter in science.
It's quite remarkable. In some ways, their thinking echoes how actual scientists approach evaluation, almost like miniature scientists, as you said before we started.
Okay, let's get into it then. Where do we start? Scientific modeling itself.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. We need to remember that modeling is absolutely core to how science actually works. It's not just an add-on.
So what exactly is a scientific model in this context?
Well, one definition describes them as representations, rules, and reasoning structures. And the key is that they let you generate predictions and explanations. They're tools for understanding.
Okay, representations, rules,
Correct.
structures for predicting. Can you give some classic examples?
Sure. Think about the big historical ones, like the Copernican model, the sun-centered solar system, replacing the older Ptolemaic Earth-centered one. That was a huge shift in modeling.
Right, that makes sense.
Or much simpler examples like using billiard balls colliding to kind of visualize how gas particles behave. Or the early Bohr model of the atom, not perfectly accurate now, but a crucial stepping stone.
Got it. So models help scientists visualize, explain, predict. But how do they choose between different models? Like, why Copernicus over Ptolemy?
Well, that's exactly where these epistemic criteria, or sometimes called scientific ideals, come in. They're the shared benchmarks.
Benchmarks. Like what are we talking about?
Well, the philosopher Thomas Kuhn mentions several key ones. There's evidential fit, basically. How well does the model actually match the observations, the data?
Okay, fit with evidence. That seems crucial.
Absolutely. Then there's explanatory scope. How much stuff can the model explain? Does it cover a wide range of phenomena or just a narrow sliver?
Right. Broader is generally better, I assume.
Generally, yes. And parsimony. Keeping it simple. Like, if two models explain the same thing, scientists often prefer the simpler, less convoluted one.
Makes sense. Don't add unnecessary complexity.
Exactly. And another one is fruitfulness. Does the model lead to new questions? Does it spark new research, new discoveries? A good model often opens doors.
Evidential fit, scope, parsimony, fruitfulness.
Yeah.
Okay, so those are the ideals. Now, how does this connect to the fifth graders in the study you mentioned?
Right. So this particular study wasn't just asking if fifth graders knew these criteria existed. It was digging deeper into their metacognitive knowledge about them.
Metacognitive. Thinking about thinking, right?
Precisely. It's about their metacognitive epistemic justifications in, simpler terms. Do they understand why these criteria are important? Why does evidence matter? Why is understandability good? It's the why behind the what.
Okay. So not just knowing the rule, but understanding the reason for the rule. How do they investigate that?
They used these really interesting clinical interviews. They talked with pairs of fifth graders. And importantly, this happened right after the students had finished a whole unit using models.
What was the unit about?
It was about eutrophication. When fertilizer runoff gets into a pond, uses up the oxygen, and the fish die. A real-world environmental problem.
Oh, right. So they were building and using models related to that specific scenario.
Exactly. They weren't just talking abstractly. They'd been grappling with modeling this specific, concrete scientific process. They'd evaluated different models of eutrophication and even developed their own ideas about what makes a good model for this problem.
So they had hands-on experience. And did the researchers give them a list of criteria to think about?
They did. To kind of focus the discussion, they made certain criteria salient. Things like internal consistency, does the model contradict itself? Accuracy, of course. Evidential fit, does it explain the causes, the mechanisms? Is it understandable? And parsimony, simplicity.
Okay, so they had those concepts introduced or reinforced.
Yes. And then each class actually worked together, guided by their teacher, to create their own consensus class criteria list.
Oh, interesting. So the students themselves helped define the standards they'd be using.
Yeah. The teachers aimed for about 5 or 6 criteria per class list, and they made sure that something related to fit with evidence was included, which happened naturally in both classes involved in the study.
Can you give us a flavor of what those class lists look like?
Sure, if we look at the source, Class A's list included things like models should make sense. Also, components and mechanisms should be clearly ordered and labeled. And importantly, each component and mechanism should have a clear explanation supported with reasons and evidence.
Okay, so making sense, being clear, and having evidence-backed explanations. What about the other class, Class B?
Class B had similar themes but slightly different wording. Their list included things like be organized, clear, and explain what is happening. Also, include relevant evidence. And another one, interestingly, specifically calling out evidence for both parts and processes. Include evidence to support both components and mechanisms.
It's really striking how both classes, independently, zeroed in on evidence and understandability or clarity.
Absolutely. They might have phrased it differently, but those core scientific values were clearly recognized as important by the students themselves.
So they have these class lists. What happened next in the interviews?
This is where it gets really insightful. The researchers asked the pairs of students to rank their own class's criteria, put them in order from most important down to least important.
Okay, ranking them. Did they just rank them, or?
No, and this is the crucial part. They had to explain their ranking. They had to provide justifications for why they thought one criterion was more important than another.
Ah, the why again. So what were the general trends? Did the classes agree on what was most important?
There were some patterns, but also differences. In Class A, the criterion models should make sense was very frequently ranked at the top.
Makes sense. So, like, coherence or understandability was key for them.
It seems so. Whereas in Class B, the criterion include evidence to support both components and mechanisms was often put in that #1 spot.
Evidence first for Class B, generally. Interesting difference. But you said the real gold was in their justifications.
Exactly. Not just the ranking, but the reasons they gave for valuing specific criteria. Let's take the importance of evidence, for example. Why did they rank evidence-related criteria highly?
Yeah, what did they say?
Well, a really common justification the study mentions 7 out of the 17 pairs interviewed was that evidence makes the model more accurate, more believable. It gives it weight.
Okay, so evidence leads to accuracy and believability. Makes sense.
Right. And another related point brought up by 6 pairs was that showing your evidence reveals the thinking behind the model. It makes it transparent, like, why did you draw it this way? Why did you connect these parts?
Ah, so it's not just about being right, it's about showing your work, essentially. Showing how you got there.
Precisely. It speaks to the transparency and trustworthiness of the scientific claim being represented by the model. They're grasping that evidence serves that function.
That's really quite profound for 5th grade.
Right.
They're connecting evidence to accuracy, believability, and transparency, not just saying evidence is good.
Exactly. They're articulating the function of evidence in science. But what was maybe even more prevalent across both classes was the justification related to understandability.
Understandability. How did that come up?
Well, remember, Class A often ranked models should make sense highest. Their reason was often very practical. If the model is confusing or doesn't make sense, then nobody can understand the explanation. The audience won't get it.
Right. A model isn't much use if it's incomprehensible.
Exactly. And similarly, in Class B, when they ranked be organized clear highly, the justification was almost always about making the model easy for someone else to follow to understand what's being explained.
So a huge factor for these kids is the communicative purpose of the model. It needs to work for an audience.
It seems that way. It's not just about the model being technically correct in some abstract sense, but about its effectiveness in conveying an idea clearly. If you can't understand it, you can't learn from it, you can't critique it, you can't build on it.
That really resonates. Clear communication is fundamental in science, and they seem to be picking up on that intuitively.
Absolutely. But their reasoning went even further. They didn't just justify why individual criteria were important. They also explained why some were more or less important than others.
Okay, so now we're getting into comparing the criteria themselves. Relative importance. What kinds of logic did they use there?
The researchers found several interesting themes in these justifications for relative importance. One was the idea of a criterion being essential to the model.
Essential, meaning what?
Meaning, they argued, without this thing like having explanations or evidence or maybe being organized, you don't even really have a proper model to begin with. It's foundational.
Okay, like a baseline requirement. What else?
Another theme was prerequisite criteria. The idea here was that some criteria need to be met before others can even be properly applied or judged.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah, like some students argued that a model first needs to make sense or be organized and clear before you can really start evaluating the evidence effectively. If it's a total mess, how can you even tell if the evidence fits?
Ah, that's very logical. You need clarity before you can assess substance. That's quite sophisticated reasoning.
It really is. Then there were ideas about some criteria encompassing other criteria.
Encompassing, like broader categories.
Sort of. For example, a student might argue that making sense is the most important, because if a model truly makes sense, it already includes having clear explanations or being understandable. It covers those other points.
So seeing relationships between the criteria. One includes others.
Exactly. And the flip side also appeared. Some criteria were seen as being entailed by others, meaning a less important criterion might be considered part of a bigger, more important one. Like, having understandable mechanisms might be seen as just one part of the overall model making sense.
They're really analyzing the structure of what makes a good model, not just listing features. They're seeing the hierarchy.
Absolutely. It's not just a flat list for them. Other justifications popped up too. Specificity was one, sometimes a more specific criterion, like having evidence for mechanisms, was ranked higher than a vaguer one.
Okay, specific over general sometimes.
And they also had reasons for ranking things lower. Sometimes they saw criteria as redundant. For example, a few students thought being organized wasn't as crucial because the modeling software they used kind of helped organize things anyway.
Huh, interesting. Using the context of their tools.
Right. Or they might see a criterion like include relevant evidence as redundant if another criterion already covered having evidence for explanations.
So looking for overlap or redundancy.
Yes. And one more fascinating reason for ranking lower was already known.
Already known. What do they mean by that?
Some students argued that certain criteria, like having a main focus related to the question they were investigating, were just obvious. Like, of course our model has a main focus. That's the whole point. So it didn't need to be ranked highly because it was sort of inherent in the task itself.
Wow. That shows a real awareness of the implicit rules of the game, doesn't it? What's just expected versus what needs special attention.
It really does. It suggests they're not just following instructions, they're thinking critically about the instructions and the context.
These justifications, essential, prerequisite, encompassing, entailed, specific, redundant, already known, they reveal such a complex way of thinking about evaluation.
They absolutely do. But perhaps the most striking finding, for me anyway, relates to what happened when students disagreed.
Okay, disagreements in the pairs about how to rank the criteria. How did that play out?
Well, the researchers observed that when pairs initially disagreed, simply stating why their preferred criterion was important wasn't usually enough to convince their partner.
Right, just repeating your point doesn't often work.
Exactly. But when they started providing justifications for the relative importance, explaining why criterion A should come before criterion B, using the kinds of reasons we just discussed, that's when they started to make progress towards consensus.
Ah. So the key wasn't just justifying the criterion itself, but justifying its position in the hierarchy relative to others.
Precisely. The act of comparing criteria and articulating why one held precedence over another seemed to be crucial for resolving their disagreements and reaching a shared understanding.
Can you walk us through an example from the study?
Yeah, there's a great one involving a pair, Chirag and Drew. They were debating whether understandable models or evidence-based models should be ranked higher.
Okay, understandability versus evidence. A classic tension, perhaps.
Right. And initially, Chirag argued for understandability because, what's the point if no one gets it? And Drew argued for evidence because that's what makes it scientific. They were kind of stuck.
Both making valid points about their chosen criterion.
Exactly. But then Chirag shifted his argument. He didn't just say understandability is good. He argued it should be more important than evidence because even if a model has tons of evidence, it's useless if it's presented in a way that's completely confusing. The understandability is like a gatekeeper for the evidence to even matter to an audience.
So he made a relational argument. Understandability is a prerequisite for evidence to have impact. How did Drew respond?
That relational justification seemed to resonate. They discussed it more, and eventually Drew came around to agreeing that maybe understandability did need to come first, or at least be ranked very highly alongside evidence. The focus shifted from my criterion is good to here's why my criterion's position relative to yours makes sense.
That's a fantastic illustration.
Yeah,
The justification for the relationship between criteria unlocked the consensus.
it really is. There's another quick example with Axel and Levin. They were discussing the main focus criterion. They both agreed it was important, but disagreed if it should be first or second.
Okay, a finer point of ranking.
Yeah. And again, it wasn't until they started explaining why it deserved a certain rank compared to the other criteria, maybe arguing it was essential or maybe arguing it was kind of already known and thus shouldn't be number one, that they could negotiate and finally agree on its placement in the list.
It really underscores how powerful this kind of metacognitive talk, justifying the relative value of standards, can be as a tool for collaborative learning and, well, for scientific discourse itself.
Absolutely. It's not just about having standards. It's about understanding the reasons behind them and being able to discuss and negotiate their importance within a community. These fifth graders were actually engaging in that process.
So if we step back and think about the big picture here, for you, our listener, I think the main takeaway is just how surprisingly capable these young students are. They're thinking critically about the very bedrock of scientific evaluation.
Yeah, the level of sophistication in their reasoning is pretty remarkable. When they talk about why evidence matters, why clarity matters, why some criteria might be more fundamental than others, they're touching on deep epistemological issues.
Epistemological concerning knowledge itself. Right. How we know what we know and why we trust certain ways of knowing.
Exactly. Their justifications often mirror the practical concerns scientists have, ensuring rigor, ensuring evidence is sound, ensuring findings can be communicated and understood by peers and the wider world. And it highlights the social aspect of science, the need for shared standards in the learning community.
It really makes you pause and think, doesn't it? What if we, as adults, were more explicit about our own epistemic criteria in everyday life?
That's a great point.
When we evaluate news sources or listen to arguments or make decisions, what if we actually stop to articulate why we value certain kinds of evidence or clarity or consistency more than others in that specific context?
Yeah, imagine debates or disagreements where people didn't just state their conclusion, but explain the standards they were using to reach it and why they prioritized those standards.
It feels like it could lead to much more productive conversations, maybe.
Yeah.
A deeper understanding, even if agreement isn't reached. Taking that moment to unpack the why behind our evaluations.
It certainly could. And this research really suggests that fostering this kind of metacognitive awareness, this ability to think about and justify our standards, can start early. It has huge implications not just for teaching science, but for developing critical thinking and effective communication skills across the board.
Absolutely. Understanding these more fundamental aspects of how we reason and how we evaluate knowledge, it really feels like it opens up new pathways for cultivating deeper understanding, not just in school, but, well, everywhere.
Well said. It's about equipping people with the tools to think critically about knowledge itself.